In 2011, revolution swept across Libya. Long ruled by the brutal dictator Muammar al-Gaddafi, the North African nation soon became a battleground of clashing ideologies and interests as its people rose up against their repressive government. However, as the world turned its gaze to Libya, one thing became clear. Under the scorching desert sun, the dreams of dictators and democracies alike can wither and burn. Libya is a land at the edge of human habitation. With over 90% of its territory covered by desert, civilization in Libya has long been concentrated on two narrow coastal belts. With its extreme geography, ethnic and tribal ties based on location and kinship have long played a prominent role in organizing society, especially outside of urban areas. However, shortly following the country's independence from Italy in 1951, Libya's harsh environment was discovered to be hiding a secret: one of the world's largest oil reserves. With the influx of massive oil revenue, the formerly destitute Kingdom of Libya was transformed into an independently wealthy state. Nevertheless, discontent soon spread, as many Libyans failed to see their quality of life rise, and Libya's pro-Western king was accused of favoring his home region and tribe over the rest of the country. Building off of these grievances, a group of army officers, led by Muammar al-Gaddafi, launched a coup d'etat in 1969 and seized control of the country, declaring a new Libyan Arab Republic. If you want to watch exclusive Armchair Historian videos, including a bonus episode about Gaddafi's all-female Amazonian bodyguard, check out our website, armchairhistory.tv, linked below with a discount. Under Gaddafi, Libya would undergo a series of dramatic reforms. Libya's oil production was nationalized, foreign property was seized, and rival political parties were banned. Gaddafi's personal ideology combined elements of socialism with his own concept of Jamahiriya, which promoted the ideal of direct democracy by the people. Gaddafi claimed that this eclectic ideology would promote unity and self-determination among Libya's tribes. But in practice, Gaddafi remained a brutal dictator who concentrated power in the hands of only those individuals and tribes who were loyal to him alone. Opposition to Libya's leader often meant death. Gaddafi did little to ingratiate himself with the international community either. Under his rule, Libya was infamous for sponsoring terror attacks around the world, including IRA attacks in the UK and a nightclub bombing in Germany. Declared a state sponsor of terrorism, Libya was subsequently the target of several American retaliatory airstrikes. By the early 2000s, however, falling oil prices encouraged Gaddafi to begin repairing his relationship with the West. While things may have been slightly improving for Libya on the international stage, the economic situation at home was rapidly deteriorating. On the surface, Libya compared favorably to many of its neighbors. Before its revolution, Libya's GDP per capita had reached over $16,000. Life expectancy had risen to 74 years, and illiteracy had almost been eliminated. For most ordinary Libyans, though, these figures meant nothing. With its finances almost entirely reliant on oil, little attention had been paid to other parts of the economy. Most Libyans worked in the country's bloated public sector for pitiful wages, often forcing them to take on a second job in Libya's shadow economy. That is, if they could find work at all. Libya's youth unemployment rate stubbornly hovered around 30%. Making matters worse, the country was in the midst of a severe housing crisis that had been left unaddressed by the Gaddafi regime. Buried under its impressive statistics, Libya was seething. In late 2010, massive protests began to rock the Arab world. Beginning in Tunisia, the so-called Arab Spring saw resentment against many of the region's authoritarian rulers bubble over into the streets. In Libya, protesters in the eastern region of Cyrenaica began to demand a solution to the country's housing crisis. Heated skirmishes with the police took place in several cities, and government offices were stormed, with protesters expressing rage at their corrupt government. Attempting to get the situation under control, Gaddafi promised to invest billions of dollars into public housing, but this was too little, too late. Soon after, a Libyan opposition group in London called on their countrymen to hold the mother of all protests on February 17, 2011. However, on February 15th, 2 days before the scheduled start of the protest, a human rights lawyer was arrested in Benghazi, setting off demonstrations across Cyrenaica. The protests turned deadly just a few days later when Libyan security forces opened fire on protesters, killing over 230 civilians. Thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Factor 75, a meal delivery service I personally use every single week. Factor first approached me a year ago to try out their pre-made, ready-to-eat meals and share what I thought about them. I've tried meal kits before, but Factor was my and my wife's favorite, primarily because it takes just 2 minutes in the microwave, and the food is high quality, not frozen or processed. As a business owner, finding time to prepare a home-cooked meal every single day is a challenge. Factor offers fully cooked, convenient, delicious, and healthy meals that save me a ton of time and effort by cutting out meal planning and preparation. Their chef-crafted, restaurant-quality meals arrive conveniently at your door, pre-prepared, eliminating the hassle of prepping, cooking, or cleaning up, and taking the guesswork out of what to make for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Factor's flexible and healthy meal preference options also include keto, calorie smart, and vegan, as well as more than 35 menu options each week. Support our channel and get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month's orders using my link in the description, or scan the QR code with your phone and sign up for Factor 75 today. What had started as a series of protests was quickly escalating into a civil war. In the next few days, events would transpire rapidly. Facing brutal violence from their government, protesters in eastern Libya began advocating for Gaddafi's complete removal from power. Driven by personal ambition, morals, or tribal loyalty, soldiers and administrators in Cyrenaica defected to the revolutionary cause, giving the protesters access to their store of small arms and heavy weaponry. In a catastrophic twist for Gaddafi, his own interior minister successfully convinced the Libyan dictator to hold off on sending additional troops to the east, before defecting himself and taking control of the growing rebellion's armed forces. With his military and administration quickly fracturing and revolts now breaking out in western Libya as well, Gaddafi found himself unable to respond. By February 27th, eastern Libya was effectively under rebel control, and a rival government known as the National Transitional Council, or NTC, was formed in Benghazi. This initial success proved short-lived, however, as Gaddafi immediately began plotting a counteroffensive to take back the country he had ruled for over 30 years. While much of Libya's regular army in the east had melted away, the core of Gaddafi's forces had always been a collection of individual military units commanded by Gaddafi's family members and tribal allies. After years of complicity in Gaddafi's authoritarian rule, many of these units saw their fate as inextricably bound to their leader and would fight loyally and brutally for him. Therefore, when Gaddafi struck back, he struck hard. After crushing dissent in the capital of Tripoli, Gaddafi's forces laid siege to the city of Misrata before advancing east along Libya's coast, rolling up rebel defenses and reaching Benghazi itself by March 19th. The situation for the National Transitional Council was growing critical. While Gaddafi advanced eastwards, the NTC scrambled to secure international support. One of its earliest acts was to write a statement that explicitly called for the international community to impose a no-fly zone over the skies of Libya. With the skilled diplomat Mahmoud Jibril at the helm, the NTC appealed directly to world leaders, convincing many of them that the NTC could provide Libya with a stable government in the event that Gaddafi was removed from power. On March 12th, the NTC would achieve a key diplomatic victory when the Arab League unanimously called for the imposition of a no-fly zone above Libya. Despite his late attempts at diplomacy, Gaddafi was still so disliked that even fellow dictators such as Syria's Bashar al-Assad ultimately agreed to encourage Western nations to intervene in Libya. On March 17th, as Gaddafi's forces closed in on the NTC's capital of Benghazi, the UN Security Council prepared to hold a vote on the imposition of a no-fly zone to protect civilians in Libya. Hours before this critical vote, Gaddafi went on Libyan television and threatened the inhabitants of Benghazi, notifying them that "we will find you in your closets" and that "we won't show mercy." With Gaddafi's ill-advised rhetoric seemingly confirming the need to protect Libyan civilians, the Security Council's vote on the imposition of a no-fly zone passed later that day, authorizing members to take all necessary measures to protect civilians and bring the fighting to an end. Libya's war was going global. Beginning on March 19th, a NATO-led coalition launched over 1,000 combat sorties against Gaddafi's forces in just 10 days, shattering Gaddafi's air defenses and smashing his armored columns advancing on Benghazi. While coalition aircraft owned the skies over Libya, the UN mandate did not allow foreign troops to directly intervene in the country's unfolding civil war. If the Libyans wanted Gaddafi gone, they would have to take matters into their own hands. To support the Libyan rebels in their efforts, an eclectic mix of nations began to arm and train the armed forces of the NTC in preparation for their inevitable showdown with Gaddafi. One of the largest supporters of the NTC's war effort was the tiny nation of Qatar, who sent more than 20,000 tons of weapons, military advisors, and, if rumors are to be believed, actual combat troops to Libya. Another key supporter of the NTC was Sudan, who had long accused Gaddafi of arming rebel groups in their own country. Seeing an opportunity to remove a hated adversary from power, Sudan opened its airspace to foreign warplanes and quickly began sending large weapons shipments to the rebel forces congregating in eastern Libya, as well as the revolutionaries still besieged in Misrata. Misrata is the third biggest city in Libya and was an early hotbed of revolutionary activity. Cut off from the NTC's base of operations in the east, but just 150 miles from Libya's capital of Tripoli, Misrata was both strategic and vulnerable. For this reason, the rebels felt it was of paramount importance to hold the city. Gaddafi thought likewise. Misrata needed to be his, every day. Rocket and artillery fire would rain down from the sky, and government forces would attempt to advance into the city. Even as coalition aircraft relentlessly bombed Gaddafi's artillery, more guns would always arrive to take their place. At times, the artillery bombardment was severe enough to close the city's port, shutting off Misrata's lifeline and throwing the defenders into desperation. The fighting became so intense that some journalists took to calling Misrata Libya's Stalingrad. While Misrata burned, rebel forces in the east attempted to break through Gaddafi's lines in Cyrenaica, but government forces held firm and the fighting remained stalemated for several months. However, with the international community firmly against him and foreign warplanes prowling his skies, every day of the conflict saw Gaddafi's forces get weaker, while the rebels, with their constant influx of foreign training and weapons, were only growing stronger. The tides would begin to turn decisively against Gaddafi in the summer of 2011. First, after a 3-month siege, Gaddafi's forces were finally defeated in Misrata on May 15th, giving the rebels a permanent stronghold within striking distance of Libya's capital. Making matters worse for Gaddafi, rebel forces, who had long been amassing in the Nafusa mountains, began to go on the offensive, breaking out of their mountain strongholds and advancing on Tripoli from the west. Both sides began to prepare for the upcoming Battle of Tripoli. Rebel forces worked tirelessly to organize themselves and integrate foreign weapons and training into their ad hoc military units advancing toward the capital. Simultaneously, They began to smuggle weapons and supplies to clandestine rebel cells within Tripoli, who would rise up against Gaddafi when the time was right. In response, government forces inside the city launched a severe crackdown targeting anyone who they suspected of aiding the revolutionaries and distributed weapons to Gaddafi's supporters inside the city. Tripoli was quickly becoming a tinderbox, and many feared that the upcoming battle would be apocalyptic. However, very few could have predicted what came next. On August 20th, rebel troops stormed Tripoli. Instead of being met with a bloodbath, Gaddafi's forces seemingly melted away without offering any serious resistance. Unbeknownst to the Libyan dictator, there were traitors in his ranks, and his own cousin, who had been charged with guarding the approach to the city, had instead ordered his soldiers to lay down their arms before defecting to the rebel cause. The road to Tripoli lay wide open, and the city fell within just 2 days. Despite this devastating defeat, Gaddafi himself managed to escape and regrouped with his remaining forces in his hometown of Sirte. Hoping to avoid a pitched battle, the National Transitional Council attempted to negotiate with Gaddafi's tribe to hand over the city, but this effort failed, leading to a new offensive. Backed up by foreign airstrikes, rebel forces soon seized most of the city, reducing Gaddafi's supporters to just 2 holdouts within Sirte. Perhaps seeing the writing was on the wall, Gaddafi himself attempted to flee on October 20th. However, as his convoy left the city, it was hit by a coalition airstrike and attacked by rebel troops. Found wounded in a ditch, Gaddafi was tortured by his former subjects before being executed without trial. The exact instances of his death remain debated to this day. With the death of Gaddafi, the NTC soon assumed full control over Libya. In July of 2012, free and fair elections were held in Libya for the first time, electing a new permanent government to replace the National Transitional Council. Libyans all across the country enthusiastically participated in their new democracy, and it seemed as if Libya was on the cusp of a new golden age. Unfortunately, this was not to be. The Libyan elections of 2012 resulted in a democratically elected government that agreed on very little. Under his rule, Gaddafi had ruthlessly crushed all rival political groups, meaning that there were few experienced leaders in the country once he was gone. Political and tribal antagonism quickly rose, and fault lines reappeared across Libyan society, a trend exacerbated by the large numbers of armed militias still roaming the country. The attack on the American consulate in Benghazi in September of 2012 signaled just how little control Libya's new government truly had over the country. As fractionalism worsened, more and more radical groups began to gain traction in the country. After years of mounting tensions, civil war returned to Libya in 2014. With their country still in crisis, some Libyans may look back on the 2011 revolution as a symbol of more optimistic days. Others, however, might just see it as the spark that set Libya on fire. Don't forget to check out our exclusive video on Gaddafi's Amazonian bodyguard on armchairhistory.tv. Your support is what makes all of this possible.